I go to a dinner that Stripe was hosting, that a bunch of founders and developers, and I just go to the room. I'm like, hey, am I a shitty engineer or is the world broken? I can't tell anymore. They were like, yeah, we're struggling too.
Hey friends, this is Podcast Ruined by Software Engineer. On this episode, I get to talk to Brian Vallelunga, founder and CEO of Doppler. Doppler is a secrets management platform captivating DevOps enthusiasts around the world. If you enjoy Podcast Ruined by Software Engineer, don't forget to hit the follow button on your podcast app so you don't miss out on the new episodes. And you can pick up podcast merch at perrytiu.com/shop. Enjoy the episode. Welcome back to another episode of Podcast Ruined by Software Engineer. I'm your host, Perry, and today with me is Brian Vallelunga, founder and CEO of Doppler. Brian, how are you today?
I'm good. It's great to be here.
I mean, this is a learning show at the end of the day, but one of the first things that obviously I can't do justice. Who is Brian and what is Doppler to begin with?
I would say outside of the normal title, founder and CEO of Doppler, I tend to be a very curious, passionate person. I'm very much like, I'm all in or all out, and there's usually no in between for me. And I'm a hardcore nerd. I could talk for hours about anything from science and startups to Star Wars and Harry Potter, you name it. And I also have I have a lot of fun doing things on the outside as well. Like I love playing pickleball. I'm super addicted to pickleball. And also a big fan of chess and board games. So that's a little bit about me. And then Doppler. Doppler is a secrets manager. So we help developers manage and sync their API keys, database URLs, and other sensitive information that is used to configure your application in a very secure way. We have companies from the largest of companies in the world, like we have Accenture, for example. That's like a pretty big customer of ours, all the way down to individual developers and hobbyists. So there's a pretty wide spectrum of customers that we support. And I think that honestly gets me up every morning and super excited. It's like, look, the value that you get to deliver to customers, I think is like the engineer's dream.
I like how you would throw the word excited out there. And for me, it's be like, I'm panicking about thinking about secrets and secrets management. But the fact that, as you were saying, there is a way to manage this. There's a way to make it easy. You could have confidence in managing all that. Of course, we're going to jump into all that. But one thing that could also help a lot of people is a bit of backgrounding, obviously, in terms of, did you just wake up being the person you are today, or was it a journey? And I would assume it's a ladder for a lot of people. Where would you say is your hometown? Where did you grow up? What did that environment look like?
I grew up in Los Angeles, and to two amazing parents, my mom and my dad. My dad was a very he was a very nerdy guy, and I think that kind of like transferred over to me, and he got me in it very early. I think to kind of like make it like share something that I feel like is pretty representative of like my upbringing. We did, I would say, ice hockey and the science fairs were like pillars of my childhood. My dad was a coach of the ice hockey team, and so we took every game very seriously, because if you won, it was really great, but if you lost, you did not hear about it. All you did was hear about it for like 5 days straight until basically the next game. So it was pretty intense in that, but it also taught me like competition. It taught me that like the best tool for learning is actually failure and losing. Like that's where you get all the good lessons. You actually don't get a lot of data from winning unless you start winning repeatedly, but hopefully you've had some losses beforehand so you know what to fix first. And then the other was science fair. I grew up pretty much doing the science fair, I would say, since middle school. And we started out doing the school science fair together, and we worked on it, and we won the school. Then eventually we won the city of Los Angeles, and then we won the state science fair of California. And that was just an incredible journey of lots of ups and downs. I mean, I was in that moment when I was doing the science fair, I was like it was kind of like this interesting duality where on one side I was pretty religiously getting picked on by everyone in school for being like the fat white Jewish kid. And then on the other side, I was like the teacher's pet that every teacher loved. And so it's like you basically got love from all the wrong cohort of people, I guess. Like you want to be loved by the students and hated by the teachers. At least that's what you think when you're that young. But it was the complete inverse. But what it did was it gave me a lot of opportunity to really just double down on my strengths, and I think that gave me a lot of the confidence I have today.
No, I absolutely appreciate that, especially the part when you said you don't get a lot of data from winning. Yeah. How much can you really learn from just a perfect life? Don't get me wrong, there are people with perfect lives out there. I'm just saying that. I don't think I'll be learning a lot from that. And of course, shout out to hockey. I'm a Montreal Canadiens fan at the end because I'm from Montreal, so always appreciate that little part to it. Funny enough, though, I keep on saying the show is called Podcast Written by a Software Engineer. But of course, you're a software engineer at the end of the day, which is why I keep on saying Podcast Written by two software engineers today. One thing I love asking is, growing up, of course, you already have some good influence of kind of like, geeky topics around you, right? Like science fair, we get to dive into a bit of like maybe biology and physics and all of that. But then the other side to me is that everybody is touching a computer at some point. And my question always is, do you remember what was your first computer?
Yeah. Oh man. It was a Windows laptop. It was a hunk of junk, but it got the job done. But I think the real first moment for me, like, it was actually not the laptop or the computer that really had like this click moment for me of like I wanted to be a software engineer. I always knew I wanted to be a builder, but I didn't really know what type. It wasn't until I had this like back in the day they had the Razor smartphone, like this flip phone. And I was in middle school, and my friend and I, we were walking to school, and he goes, "It'd be so great if I could just watch a movie on a phone." And again, this is the days before an iPhone, so like that wasn't really a thing. These phones were mainly meant for texting and calling. That was like the extent of capabilities of this phone. And I just remember thinking, well, I have a camera on this phone, and if I record something with the camera, I can play it back. So I have playback capabilities. I can actually record something and watch something. And so I was thinking, well, what if I took a movie that I really like, and that night I came home and I popped open this movie and I ripped the DVD, and basically that's like a process of like converting the DVD into like a file that you can watch on your computer. And then I recorded a video of the floor in my room, and I put that on a micro SD card and I popped it in my computer, and I saw what format that was in. And then I converted the video of the movie that I liked into that format, and I put it on the SD card and plugged it back in the Razor. And the next day I go to my friend and I'm like, "Hey, look at this. It's a full 2-hour movie now playing on the Razor." And it was just like this moment of like I saw like the shock on his face of it's like a whole new world opened up to him. And in that moment, I was like, and we never actually watched the full movie. Like, I don't think I ever watched a full movie on the Razor. It was too painful. The screen was too small. The audio sucked. Like, was not a good experience. But it taught me this powerful lesson of like that software can bring delight into the world, and it can bring magic, and it can open up opportunities, and it can get your mind thinking in all these creative ways that you just never expected before. And that really spoke to me. And I just went on this journey after that of like pushing the bounds of seeing what I could do with software.
That story, I love it in the sense of course, people do remember the Razor days where it's like the flip phone. And at some point they have like the sliding one, but no matter which Razor phone it was, the screen was tiny. So I can't imagine what that movie would have looked like when you're watching that over there. And of course, the days of like the ripping all the movies and burning them on like either CDs or trying to get them into like SD cards or anything like that. I think that's always been something where you don't really ask for permission. And the best way possible is that, innovation and trying to, make cool things, but also useful things at the end. That was exactly an example of what your brain kind of looks like, right? And of course, like today, you still do a lot of stuff like that. But with your journey, eventually you go to school. Was it clear to you that you were going to go into this path of like building things with software? I mean, of course, you had that great example over there, but academia-wise, was it something that you wanted to align with that idea at the end as well?
Yeah. So when I was doing the science fair, it had nothing to do with computer science for the most part. Like the first couple years didn't. Like we built a craft that flew using ionic propulsion, so it weighed less than your fingernail and flew with no wings or engines, and it was so cool. And what I learned is, even though it's really cool, it was not meant for me. And I basically was like this process of elimination of like, okay, tried this, did not click. Like, love physics at conceptual level, hate it at a mathematical level. Just did not click with me. Same with biology and chemistry. But then there was like this thing in the background that always felt like a safe place to me of like computer science, or not really in computer science, just programming and building things. And like, honestly, for like the longest time, I didn't even really want to go to college. It was just my dad was a professor, and he was like, "That's the path." It was very clear in his mind. It's like, if you didn't go to college, you were a homeless person deemed by society. There was no other way around it in his worldview. And so computer science was like the obvious step for me. And then every moment that I was in school, I was trying to find a way to get out of school. I picked a school that was close to Stanford and Silicon Valley so that eventually I could jump into Silicon Valley someday, which I did. And so I dropped out twice through that process. Um, and both times I thought my dad was going to completely disown me, and he almost did once. He was just so mad about it. And now looking back, like many years later, I'm like, I actually wish I stayed in school because I don't know. It's kind of like when you got to be at the right place at the right time to receive the right information. And if you weren't, my head just wasn't there. My head was like in the clouds thinking about like, can I build the next startup? Versus now I'm like, it'd be so great if I just went to the classroom and just absorb some great content without having to like struggle to understand all this stuff. If someone just like plain spokenly explain it to me. And I don't really care about the tests and all that, but I care about the knowledge itself. So it's funny how things have changed over the years.
That perspective, I cannot agree more. I feel like everybody around the age, when the first time you choose a university or a program to go into, you've barely lived life. You're like, not saying that you can't live life after 16, 17, 18 years or whatever it is, but there's so much more out there that you kind of realize that it's the context, as you're saying, how you're thinking, where my approach or my understanding for a lot of people doing university is like speed running it. Just being like, I want to get rid of it. And that is not beneficial to actually caring about the content, right? I agree with you. If I go back to, if I ever go back to do like a master's or whatever today, I'd love the content. I'd be like, I'll take it to something not related to computer science. I'd do like finance or something. And then I'd be so interested in learning, I don't know, the factory line of Ford or something. But anyway, I'm digressing over here. Obviously, coding is a part of everybody's lives at some point when you go into computer science and going into software engineering roles more than anything. Do you remember the first time you wrote code? Was it before you got into the computer science program or was it after? At what point did you get introduced to your for loops and your variables out there?
Yeah, I would say the first time I wrote some code was my freshman year of middle school. So it's pretty early. So actually, elementary school was when the Razor phone thing happened that got me interested in like the world of like what you can do with software and then and problem solving. And then the freshman year of middle school is when I wrote my first lines of code. So by the time I got to college in computer science, in my computer science classes, the programming parts of the classes were really easy for me. The understanding linear algebra and that kind of stuff was actually pretty difficult, and I struggled with it for a bit. But the programming part was like so intuitive. Like I honestly didn't even attend class. I was like, give me the assignment. I'll jam out on the assignment for like 30 minutes, and then I'll get back to the actual hard problems of like building a startup. So yeah, I would say I was like pretty ahead of the curve in some areas, and then pretty far behind the curve in others, like the mathematical side.
Oh yeah, proving so many proofs in linear algebra. I remember so many of that. And of course, I got to geek out. What was the language that you learned when you were in middle school? Do you remember?
It was JavaScript. So it was like HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and PHP. I started out on PHP, and then at some point I discovered Node.js, and I was like, wow, this is like an enormous step up. Like I was like, the world just changed in my eyes. How big of a delta like an Express app was versus a PHP app.
And of course, people will bring up the stat like, oh yeah, 66% of the internet is still powered by PHP or something like that today. Like, I think everybody has affinity for what they've loved from the beginning. Shout out to JavaScript, of course. Shout out to PHP, all the lovely languages. But I cannot not mention that you're a serial entrepreneur. Like, on record, I don't know how many failed startups. You might even clarify how many failed startups you had today. But I think the journey of going into, I guess, like this academia role and then figuring out like, where am I at the moment? Do I start immediately a project? Do I keep on going? A lot of things was probably going through your mind. A lot of things just go through a lot of people's mind today at school, being like, what am I going to do? So what did that look like at that time? Did it immediately, like you were studying and then you just propelled yourself into this path of like entrepreneurship? Or what was the steps that you took at that point?
I'd known since a pretty early age that when I say early, I mean like middle school, that I wanted to be a founder of a tech company. Like for every kid that was studying like the NBA players, I was studying founders. Like I had my flashcards of founders and their stories, and I could recite them to you like the back of my hand. I knew all their stats, all their moves. So I was like fully invested in that, and I had done probably like 3. Looking back now, they're more like projects. but they felt like startups at the time, before college. And so I came into college with a startup in mind, and I was like so convinced that I was going to drop out of college for that startup. Um, it was actually a couple startups later that I did drop out the first time, and then went back to school, and then did a couple more startups, and then dropped out a second time. But it wasn't. It was more like I had to find the energy and willpower to power through school versus the willpower to start a company. Like working on a company felt like my safe place. It felt like where I should put all my energy, and everything else was just distraction that I had to get through because the parents said so, and or life and society said that you need a college degree. So I don't know. I felt maybe that's a very contrarian story. Like I feel like a lot of people I know, it's like they go through college and then they jump out at some point because some magical event happens. And for me, it was like I always felt like this was what I was meant to do. Try or fail, but like this is what I was meant to do. And I don't think I could ever see my life in another way. And I always had this like grounding belief that it does not matter how many times you fail, for two reasons. One, every time you fail, if you're smart, you get better, and so you don't make the same mistakes again. You make new mistakes, and so you're constantly getting better. And I found that like if you look at like the track record of every startup I did, I think Doppler startup 8 or 9 now. Every startup I got better. I didn't make the same mistakes. I made different mistakes, and I got farther along. And Doppler is clearly the farthest startup I've ever taken. The second is that you only need one success. One success, and for what it's worth, when I define success, I do not mean a multi-billion-dollar IPO or something like that. I mean like raising a seed round and then going and doing a Series A, like the beginning steps. Because once you get to like past that seed round, like there's a lot of like momentum you have that just keeps propelling you. And there's a lot of like asymmetrical advantages you get from it. For example, you now have a network of people you can raise capital from. You now know how to recruit and hire. You now know how to build a product and start building and go to market motion for it. You pretty much have done every role in the business to some degree, from finance to design to marketing to product to engineering, that you know how all those things work. You are like so asymmetrically better than the average person now from a skill standpoint, because you've just done more jobs, like a higher diversity of jobs than another person who hadn't done that, who hadn't taken that path. And that really compounds on itself over time, right? And then eventually you get to a point where like, even if you're like a Series A founder, you could start like having some like personal liquidity with secondaries, which is like a very common thing in the industry. And so you don't really need to go IPO to like even become like a millionaire with cash. Like that's pretty easy once you get to a Series A. And so I don't know, it just felt like it wasn't all or nothing. It wasn't like this framing of like 95% of startups die or something. That's like what my dad used to tell me all the time. It was like completely wrong, because even if you just get to the starting line, you're already so much better off than like if you didn't do that.
I echo the celebration of 0 to 1s more than the 99 to 100s, right? The 99 to 100s, those IPOs, those like Series F or whatever you want to call it. But then like the 0 to 1s are so cool. I keep on saying it's like the birthing of a lot of projects. And for you, obviously, we're going to jump into a couple of examples of the ones that you've done previously and how Doppler came about to be. But one thing I probably just want to double click actually was, do you think where you were living and studying around the, I guess, like initially LA area, then we're talking about the Bay Area, I believe you went to UC Santa Cruz, the whole like effect of Silicon Valley and everything. Do you think that had the influence? Because me personally, I'll share a bit on my perspectives that like I grew in Montreal, I ended up living in London, New York City, San Francisco. But San Francisco and the Bay Area has been the area where even your letterman knows about the Slack acquisition. Do you know what I mean? Like even like the concepts of Series A and just like how does, I guess, like stock equity work, like that's been just so much louder around that area. So maybe from your perspective, do you think if you weren't living around that area, if you didn't grow up in LA, if you didn't grow up in California, you would have the same like attitude you have today towards this, like, oh, let's build things and everything?
That's hard. I would say that I didn't really know what really equity was or anything like that till I really started doing my first like real startup. Like probably one before Doppler was like the first real one in my mind, and that was squarely when I was in San Francisco. And so I don't think I really knew much about the true startup world until I got to SF. Like the biggest lessons that Los Angeles and Santa Cruz taught me was I don't want to live there and I don't want to do what everyone else is doing there. Like that just seemed like so wrong for me personally. Not to say it's wrong for everyone else, but just for me, I was like, I am not supposed to be here in this moment. And I could just feel that like bone deep. And I think once I got into San Francisco, it was like this wave of knowledge that just like hit me like a tsunami. And I was learning. I remember like telling my mom, I was like, I'm learning more in the last 3 months. Because at some point I dropped out of college to go work at Uber and then eventually started Doppler. And when I was at Uber, I was like, Mom, I'm learning more in the last 3 months than I've learned in the last 3 years of college. Like that's the rate of knowledge capture that's happening here, and also like deployment of that knowledge, which then gives you like expertise and wisdom. And so I think it was really the San Francisco that was a big turning point for me of like, okay, I felt like I was like a fast car stuck in neutral in a garage, and now I could finally run free on the Autobahn. You know what I mean? I could run fast or drive fast. And every mile that you take, you get more knowledge and wisdom from it until you get to become a pro driver.
I love this because it usually is a switch between when you talk about academia, it's about like technical knowledge, it's about theory, it's a lot of like just building up a knowledge, and then once you get to apply it, that's usually the part where you realize that hey, you could do something about it. You could apply this and build. I mean, I'm assuming at Uber they had loads of algorithms and loads of stuff happening over there. So this is the part where I feel like the switch, and then once you capture it with your drive and your ability to be like, let's apply this, I feel like that really turns out to bigger projects. So. Before we jump to the Doppler, the one right before it, I'm always curious about that because, as you were saying, like it's hardly your first attempt that's gonna make you the most successful, person out there, right? So even before we jump into Doppler, what was that thing that you were considering as your first startup? What was the idea? Where did that come from? Was it also while you were working, while you were in school? Like, when did that happen?
Yeah, that one was while I was at Uber, and I just remember it was like the beginning of the crypto craze, and like ML was like it wasn't really like the AI that we have today. It was more like big data, like that was really the way of thinking about it. And I just remember thinking, well, there's like no really good coins out there that make a lot of sense outside of Bitcoin and Ethereum. And even then, I like at that time I was pretty speculative both, and I remember thinking, well, it'd be so great if there was like some marketplace where people could list their machine learning models and other people could pay using this coin to compute on it and run inferences. And then people could host their compute. So it's like a three-sided marketplace. One side could list their compute, the other side could list their models and get paid, and one side could pay to run inferences on that compute and those models. And man, that was a grind. That startup did not go anywhere at all. Like that was one of the hardest startups I've ever done. But I learned an immense amount of like A, what it's like to build a real product, B, to get real customer feedback, to like the whole process of like building a real startup was like seared into my mind during that project of that startup.
I really do relate the part in the sense of like when you start with nothing and you try to figure out how much do you want to build before you start sharing it with people, basically. Maybe for that example that you're talking about, was it obvious in the sense of, oh, I need to build everything first and then show it to people, or I need to build kind of maybe 80% of it and then show it to people, or do I just build like a really simple 20% to 30% of the feature and then start showing it to people?
I did the engineer's path first, and I just built everything before I showed it to a single person, which was like the absolute wrong move. And then on top of that, I made a couple like absolute newbie mistakes. Like at some point, I kind of gave up on the crypto side pretty quickly, and it became just like a two-sided marketplace where we provided the compute and we had a Stripe for payment processing. And I accidentally put the staging Stripe key in production and the production one in staging. So for about a month straight, we weren't doing any transactions. And it wasn't until I realized that I had the wrong API keys in the wrong environments that I realized that. And it was like completely my fault. And again, that was because I failed to even user test my own thing. I was like so rigorously testing it in staging that I didn't really test it in production. And the staging one worked fine. The dev one worked fine. I didn't even test it in staging all that much because I know, like, I wasn't focused on testing and users. I was focusing on like building. Like I was so much in overdrive of build mode. There was no PM in my mind. There was no like user feedback person in my mind. It was just all build, and eventually money will be at the end of this. And I was totally wrong. So yeah, I would say what I would do going forward is I'd probably build like 20%, something, or maybe like 30, somewhere in that range, where it's enough to tease out the most important parts of the product. And then from there, I'd focus rigorously on getting feedback. And then if I got more passion and green lights from it, I would kind of take it a step further.
I mean, even the past 2-3 minutes of you just describing like those stories, so many lessons jumped out from that. In terms of, yes, like it's not because it works on dev that's gonna work on production. And that's an absolutely great segue, because a lot of the apps depends on environment variables and secrets and a lot of this management, and that is like a big essence of what Doppler is today. So even originally, maybe I could probably take a moment to do this, is the name Doppler. I've said it a couple of times already. What was the inspiration behind it? Or did you have like the domain from a long time already and then just use it? Like, I feel like everybody has a little story behind that, and you are probably the best person to ask this to.
Yeah, it wasn't anything like, oh, Doppler has this hidden meaning and we're trying to capture that. Um, I knew what I didn't want, which is I didn't want a name that exactly spelled out what we did, like secrets.com or something, because then you're trapped in just doing secrets management. Um, and I wanted a name, more importantly, that when people heard it, they thought this is where I could do the best work of my career. Like it's a name that's so good that we're gonna have to earn it every single day and really perform at our best to keep that name alive. And we were just going through a ton of names, and Doppler just like was like one that was like, it was easy to spell. People had heard about it in the past because they had learned about the Doppler effect in school, but totally forgot all about it. So like there's some like built-in like brand recognition, and it felt like really sciencey and to me and like techie to me. It didn't. And the one sad part was the domain was taken, and it was like this broker in China that was like that had the domain, and so we had to negotiate over WeChat to bring the domain from $750,000 down to $150,000. And this is before we had any funding, and we had to time the raise with the purchase. And we eventually got it to like 50K installments, 3 installments of 50K for a total of 150. And we found out like many months later, after the sale had completed, that it was actually a dude in Texas that owned the domain. And he just, for some reason, I guess, thought that like someone in China would be the one that bought it. And so it's like we were basically talking Chinese over this WeChat app using Google Translate to then them relay it back to some dude in Texas who then relayed it back. And like I was like, wow, this was like horribly inefficient. Like this is the exact epitome of like what tech is all about.
And that also is such an eye-opening story in the sense of like that kind of stuff can happen. And for the other people on the other end to be like, what, like 750K or even 150K for a domain, like it's always mind-boggling. But then again, like if you think about like return on investment and you think about the brand and think about like the power of something that's domain, I'm sure you have a way bigger dictionary in terms of why it's justifiable to be doing those kind of transactions.
Yeah, I think you touched on it. It's like if you build a really great product, you're naturally going to build a really great brand, I hope. And, let me put it more clear. If you build a product that has very strong product market fit, then you will naturally build a really strong brand. And you want that brand to be easily discoverable, easy to spell, and it feel accessible, and also intuitive. And that just costs money because it's a valuable asset. Like, there's a reason why, like, basic words like Amazon and stuff like that are going to be very hard domains to buy, even if, like, Amazon, the company, didn't exist today. It's because that name is easy to spell, it's intuitive, you've already heard about it. And so there's a reason why there's real price tags for those. And once you have it, you're the only one in the world who can have it, right? So there's a lot of value there. So it made sense to me. Like, it was like a one-time investment. I mean, even when you raise like a couple, like I think we raised $2 million for our seed round. Like, even when you do that, 100K, 150K paid over like, or 150K paid over like 3 years, it's not a bad deal. Like, especially by the third year, you're going to raise a Series A and you're going to have like 15 to 20 million in the bank. It's not a bad deal. I'd take that deal every single day of the week.
And of course, like, what is it? The rules of sales and marketing. You have to spend money to make money. But on that front, though, in the sense of like, when you started this project, were you still working ? Or like, when did that happen? Or were you just soul searching? I don't know. I've put a lot of contrast in terms of how do people like start their projects. But for Doppler itself, do you remember, was it night and day in terms of like, oh, I'm investing 100% of my time to go into this project? Or what did that look like?
Yeah, I was working at Uber, and the idea just popped in my mind. I was talking to some coworkers about the crypto machine learning marketplace, and that was called Doppler too, at the time. And so we it was like we were thinking about it, and then we were like, let's just do it. And so what we started doing was we started working on it at nights and weekends. And so like I would wake up at like 10 a.m. or sorry, at 9 a.m. to get to work by like 9:30, 10. I would stay till dinner time of like 6:30, 7. I would get home at like 7:30 to 8. And then from 8 to like 2 a.m. I'd work on Doppler. And then on the weekends I'd work on Doppler. And at some point, then we pivoted into the secrets management product. And basically, at some point, I was just like, I'm not going to make this crypto machine learning marketplace or this machine learning marketplace work. And so I started looking at all the problems that I was facing. And managing secrets was just one that was happening again and again and again. It was like this really painful problem that had one single root problem, but it had a lot of different like child problems to it. Or I feel like I'm missing the word, but dependency problems. Long story short, there was a lot of reasons, a lot of problems I was having based on a root problem. And I was like, okay, this is something that I feel uniquely qualified to solve. This feels like a real problem because I'm facing it. I know I'm facing it. I go to a dinner that Stripe was hosting, that a bunch of founders and developers, and I just go to the room. I'm like, hey, am I a shitty engineer or is the world broken? I can't tell anymore. And they were like, yeah, we're struggling too. And so that was a pretty big signal to me that we should build something. And after a couple weeks of more research, we decided to build an MVP. We got the MVP up in like 3 weeks, and the 4th week we got some customers from it. And this was all while I was still at Uber. So, and then we went to investors and we said, look at all that we had done while working at Uber. Imagine if we were full time. Imagine what we could accomplish. And that was basically the early pitch to get the initial set of capital in.
I like how the part it's this idea really came from the fact that you were scarred from putting a staging key to product. I'm sure there was a lot of other reasons, but as you were saying, like you don't learn until you know either get burned by something or something just goes wrong. And it did happen to me a couple of times. Well, maybe once or twice where I've uploaded a wrong key somewhere. But
yeah, I mean it's 100% true. And also like going back to like knowing those like founders and their stories, I mean that's part of what inspired me here. Is like I think Stuart Butterfield from Slack is like one of the best in the world at failing upwards. Like tries to create a video game, born out of that, fails. Born out of that was like Flickr. Then he's like, I'm gonna go and create a video game for real this time. Fails again. Born out of that was Slack that we all use, like including Doppler, right? So like I was just like, okay, can I fail upwards here? Can I learn from something here and pull some gem out of it? And Doppler was what came out.
And of course, this is the part where we get to geek out a bit. These kind of like two-part question, or this two-part question is more like, what is Doppler today? And then, of course, the follow-up question was, what was it like initially? So for today, Doppler, if you had to explain it, like kind of like an ELI5 thing, how do you use it? What is it for? What is Doppler?
So imagine you're a developer. If you are a developer, you don't need to imagine. You're probably writing code every day, and that code talks to a database. It probably talks to some payment processor, probably talks to Twilio for messaging, and maybe a bunch of other services. And it also has some configuration like a port variable, so you know what port to run on, or a logging statement to know how to print your logs. All that is configured by the environment. And I would say a big portion of those environment variables are very sensitive. You don't want them to get out in the public. Like you don't want the API key or your database URL to get out in the public. That's really bad if that happens. And so just like you need a password manager for managing like human passwords, you need the exact same thing for secrets, which are like these environment variables. And so that's what Doppler does. We manage these environment variables. And the big thing that we do today is we make sure that it works for every type of infrastructure, every type of setup. You could be a monolith of microservices, you could be on Kubernetes, you could be on Lambdas, you could be a React stack. It doesn't matter. We can support all of that. Where it started in the very beginning was like a JavaScript SDK, and that was it. And like that was like the very like basically I assume the entire world ran a JavaScript because I was like hyper enthusiastic about JavaScript. And we learned very quickly that it was like they wanted more than one language support, so we built Python and Ruby SDKs. And then they were like, we want more than that. So we were like, okay, I'll build a CLI that's written in JavaScript. And it was like, yeah, it could support every programming language now in every framework. But the problem was it also required JavaScript, which they didn't want. So then we rewrote the CLI again, this time in Go, so that it didn't have any dependencies and it's just a binary. And that was like the very early innings of Doppler. And then at some point, customers are like, well, we don't trust that you're going to be up and operational all the time. You're just a startup. And so we started building sync infrastructure where we can sync secrets over to AWS or GCP or GitHub, so that even if Doppler was down, it didn't actually bring you down. And that was probably a pretty big tipping point for us on like really doubling down on like integrations and all the orchestration layer that we have today.
I've got so many questions. I mean, of course, since the beginning, I've got so many questions, but this is so fun. My brain is like spinning because when we're talking about like how people interacted today, I'm assuming, if I got that correctly, Doppler, is it hosted? As in, like, is it a hosted solution where people get to log into a website and all the thing over there? Or do you offer self-hosting to people? This is where I want to compare today, and then we're just going to step back after into the SDK days a little bit. But today, how does somebody interact with the Doppler, I guess, platform mostly?
It's all cloud hosted. We've debated pretty rigorously internally over many, many years, over several debates too, about doing on-prem or not. And where we stand today is that we want the Doppler experience to be the best you can possibly have for this tool. We think that the level of secrets or the level of sensitive data that you're storing these secrets is so severe that you just need the best in class experience. And if you are going to have the best in class experience, you really can't do that on-prem, because by going on-prem, you're basically giving up control. You're giving up how they deploy it, and all of a sudden, like a classical example, like you'll hear all the time is like, we deploy this on-prem, it's working really great. The person who bought it doesn't even work at the company anymore, and they want but there's some bugs somewhere. And so an engineer reports a bug to the company, and the company's like, okay, yeah, we fixed it. Redeploy your infrastructure now, this on-prem deployment with this new version. And they go, oh, we don't know how to do that anymore. And like now it has to go through this crazy ticket system that's going to take a year. We even heard a quote from someone in the military that said something like, you have a higher chance of dying before we will even upgrade our software. And so it's like, okay, how can we provide a best-in-class experience at that point if we can't control the infrastructure? And I think at some point we will be forced to go on-prem, and for the very largest of largest customers. But we're going to try our damnedest to be super successful without that for a very long time.
No, I can definitely imagine there's a lot of trade-offs, as you were saying, right? The fact that it's all hosted now, as in the fallback stuff, right? If anything like goes missing or anything, you probably have a copy if it's connected somewhere. So that's usually what the syncing stuff. Of course, you require a lot of like internet connection for that. And the thing that I love comparing it to, as we were saying, you're discovering a lot of these like JavaScript SDK and even like the CLIs, which is command line interface. What it stands for more than anything is that. So if I understood this correctly, back then, to, I guess, like manage secrets and to be able to work with all of that, is you mostly had to do it through either your application, you would import the SDK into your app, and then you'd be able to manage your keys, or what did that look like? Was it basically that?
We always had a dashboard. I think that was actually one of our biggest strengths from the early days, was we had this very intuitive dashboard to manage secrets. And then the SDK was primarily used to fetch those secrets in the application at runtime or at boot time. So that model has been pretty consistent. I think the big shift we've made is that we've switched off of SDKs for most use cases, and now we inject it through the Doppler CLI, the Doppler command line interface, or we write it directly into your infrastructure like AWS, GCP, or GitHub or Azure, or whatever it may be.
Gotcha. So people don't have to deal with the .env files, so the .env.local and .env.
Oh my gosh, those, even though they are like super easy to use, and I get why developers love them. I used to love them for years. They are incredibly insecure. Like, they're one of the leading causes of data breaches. And also, I want to call this out, because I don't think a lot of people think about it or talk about it a lot, is that the cost of a data breach. Like, I keep hearing all the time of, oh, a data breach, it's not that bad. It's like 1 day's worth of revenue. We'll just get this slap on the wrist and we'll keep moving forward, and maybe we'll get some bad press. But it turns out that bad press isn't that bad, because people aren't going to remember the bad part of the press, and they'll just remember the name was in the news. And now Equifax is amazing, right? Like, that's usually how it goes. And like half the companies I talk to, that's what they would say. But like, I think there's one very important element that's missing from all this that I think is also super important to developers, which is that the data that's getting breached is real customer data. It's like your customer's data. And if you think about how at least us as Americans, we navigate the US, we go and we use services like, if you're driving somewhere, you probably are using Google Maps or you're using Uber. If you're watching something, it's probably on a streaming service or on YouTube, right? Like almost all of our lives are through these services and all that data they collect on us. And so when a data breach happens, it's real people's data that's getting out there, and that can have incredibly detrimental impacts to them. And so while the company almost always just gets a slap on the wrist and moves on, it's the real people at the end of the day that actually pay the price of this data breach. And it could literally just because some developer decided to put it all in a file because it was easier and faster. And that's like a huge majority of the causes is from that exact example.
Of course, how it impacts people's day to day. I think some people always complain like, why am I getting so many spammy texts? It's probably because somebody found a way to like get all the phones from somewhere. And then people are like, oh, why does XYZ happen? Why do people send me like credit card offers in like my mailbox every day? It's probably something related to these breaches here and there, left and right.
But it gets worse than that. I mean, like real example, I moved to Austin, Texas pretty recently, and I flew my mom out from LA to join me to taste some barbecue. And we are at this barbecue restaurant, and I get this call while we're there, and it's this person claiming to be from Texas Borders and Customs. And they're like, hey, we have this illegal package and money with your name in it, and you're being federally investigated now. You cannot hang up from this call. Everything you say will be recorded and used in the investigation. And at that moment in my life, I legitimately thought my life was over. Like, I was like, this is a moment I go from being a CEO to going behind bars, and I have no clue why. And they started to ask me all these questions, like, did you live at this place at this time? Did you do this? Did you do that? And it felt so credible because it was like, who else would have this kind of information? And it wasn't only until about an hour and a half in, when I had my lawyers on the call, did we realize that like it was a scam. But through that, they got so much more information about me that they can use in a later attack. And you got to think about it. Like, I have lawyers on the call. I have security training. I run a cybersecurity company. And even I got fooled for an hour and a half. Imagine my mom or your parents or your friends that have no security training, that have no lawyers to lean on. And they are going to get robbed blind because this attack is going to feel so unbelievably credible that they're just going to give away all their important information. And all of a sudden, someday they're going to wake up and their credit card, their credit status is terrible. Their bank accounts are drawn dry. And it's just a really scary world. And so, especially if you don't have that training, even if you do have that training, it's still hard. And that's the real cost, I think, that people are going to pay. And they're going to keep paying it until companies care about this and developers act appropriately.
Yeah, because this really started from like a mishap of, hey, we probably should have done this protection earlier than not. So maybe I could play the role of a more or less, I'm not going to say dumb engineer, but more like not prepared engineer more than anything is, oh, look, I'm writing code and everything. And, oh, I obviously want to integrate with Twilio and they give me this like cool like key or whatever. I'm just going to paste it in my code. What? It's going to work directly there. I'm just going to do a whatever const Twilio key equals and then put it there and then just deploy that. Some people will listen to this and they'll be like, Perry, what are you doing? But some other people will be like, wait, that's exactly how you're supposed to do it. So, Brian, if you see me do this, what is wrong, basically? I know it's wrong, just saying, but what is wrong with the scenario of me just pasting the key in my code and just being like, it's ready to go, let's do this?
Well, first off, I'll say there's a huge spectrum of things you can do. And that example is literally the worst one you can do. Like, by definition, it is the worst. And the reason why it's the worst is because you have this secret that's now stuck in the repository and all the history. So even if you just remove it later, it's stuck in the history there. And if you're, there's like a quote that, or there's a stat that says something like, within 30 seconds of a repo going public, bots can find any secret in the history of a repo and then start using it. So you basically have literally 30 seconds of your code accidentally getting leaked on the internet before something really bad can happen. And you'd say, oh, that's never going to happen to me. Well, it happened to Twitter, happened to Twitch, happened to Toyota. Like, it's happened to a number of companies. And also, for what it's worth, it may not even be a breach where you actually make your repo public. It could also be that an employee walks away with it and their laptop gets stolen and then it happens. Or some person clicks on an email that they shouldn't have and that then their computer gets compromised and that computer has access to the repository. So there's like 1,000 ways someone can get access to the repository without the repository itself being leaked on the internet. And remember, even if you remove the secret from the code base, it's still in the history. So that is like the worst of the worst way to do it. What you really should do is you should have you should have all that sensitive information configured by the environment, and then it gets injected into the environment by a secure place like a secrets manager. And I'm not advocating for you to strongly use Doppler. If you don't want to use Doppler, I'd love to hear why first, but don't use it. But use something. Use AWS Secrets Manager, GCP Secrets Manager, GitHub, whatever it may be. There are ways. GitHub has a secret store there for their workflows. I'm not saying put it in code, but there are a number of tools that you can use so that secrets are not unencrypted on disk and stored in the Git history.
Yeah, and I could see why you would do that. I've seen so many examples of even the people that just like scrape repos. Sometimes you could even ask like a Copilot or something, be like finding a key, or they autocomplete the key. I think they took out the feature, but I remember there's something in the news where if you started typing some like AWS region key or whatever, they'll literally try to spit out a key for you, which is quite funny. And the other part to it is, of course, like when we talk about this, I guess like secrets management. So number one, we've answered kind of why we need secrets to begin with, right? Like if you want your own custom tool, your own custom Stripe, or your own custom like access to specific APIs or whatever, that's why you have these secrets going on for it. But on the other side, in the sense of like how, like the management part, the secrets management, let's jump into the management part, is that we're not talking about one or two secret here, right? A lot of the applications, I've worked on applications that probably have like over 100, 200 secrets for a single application, for a single deploy, if anything. So maybe from your perspective, this is me just being geeky more than anything. Is that common? Is that common for people to have like a couple of hundreds keys for a single application? Or is it mostly like in the dozens, if anything? Because that kind of emphasizes like the management part of, I guess, Doppler, but also just managing keys in general.
Yeah, I think the stats that are inside our company right now, at least from our users, is that it's like 80 secrets for a given application. And then remember, you have multiple environments. You have development, staging, and production, maybe even CI/CD. And so now you got to times that by 3 or 4. And then I think the average company has something like 10 or 15,000 secrets. So there's a lot of secrets in any company. And again, they're all floating around. And like if you can answer these 4 questions confidently, you know you do not have a problem and you're in the clear. The first question: do I know where all my secrets are? Because if you don't know where all your secrets are, you cannot protect them, right? Not possible. The second is, can you put access controls in place for those secrets? Can you say, these production secrets, only 5 people have access to. These development secrets, every developer has access to. Do you have a complete audit story of every time that secret is read and updated? That's super important, because if you have a data breach, you kind of want to be able to say, this person was the one that leaked it. Now we know what to do. We need to go talk to them, or we need to revoke their access, or we need to do XYZ thing. And then is the way that I get secrets into my infrastructure, does that happen in an automated fashion? Because if you have to put it in a ticket and then wait for someone else to approve it, then your code is going to get rolled out automatically, right? The second you click the merge button in a pull request, it goes out to production. Or when you do git push, it'll roll out to production. If that doesn't happen with secrets too, you have a big problem, because that code is going to rely on those secrets. And so now you have this race condition that will manifest an outage. And then the last one is when shit really hits a fan and you do have a data breach, and you should assume it's not an if, it's a when. So when this event happens, can you stop the data breach without bringing yourself down very quickly? Like, you don't want to have to learn how to firefight when you're in a fire. You want to come in knowing how to firefight when you enter a fire, right? That's why firefighters get training before they walk into a burning building. Same exact thing here. And so if you can't answer those 4 questions, you guaranteed have a problem. If you can answer all 4 very confidently, then you don't have a problem. And I think it's just that simple.
Yeah, and who cares about what industry you're in? I think regardless of if you're in finance, in healthcare, especially in healthcare, if you have a data breach there, that's absolutely like terrible, all the PHIs and all the legal stuff behind it. But as we were saying, like this kind of measure that you could take, and as we were saying, like the whole point of listing all these questions that you're asking, the whole point of listing all these like I don't even know the answer to half of your question at the end of the day. It's because it's necessary at some point. If I were to be in a firefighting situation today, like I've worked all across startups and all across tech, and you probably agree that a lot of them don't even think about this question for most part. to it. What my logic, last time I had to fight something like this was that all the keys got like, I think there was like a breach from a third party vendor or something. And I remember we had to, number one, look for the keys. Where are they to begin with? And then somebody had to make like an Excel sheet, so with all the keys, and you realize that like half of them we don't have access to the keys, and then the other half is not being used, and then another half to be like super critical that we need to redeploy, but there's no way to generate a new key. I'm just listing a bit of like contrast in terms of like, oh, here's what I think a lot of people are still doing today. And then by the time you manage to find the new keys, you try to redeploy it and you realize you can't deploy it because some other configuration is not working through that. So this is my hellhole when stuff like that happens. But in contrast, I'm assuming through Doppler, these are all features that are supported, right? As in, could you do a quick fire drill of if I had Doppler in that case, what would that look like?
Yeah, so if you had Doppler, let's just say a single secret, so not that bad. One individual secret gets leaked. You would immediately search that value in Doppler. We'd show you all the places that have it automatically. You'd have like this list, and then you can go one by one, and it's called rotating. Rotating is the ability to swap out an old one with the new one. It's kind of like swapping out the locks on a door. And we, depending on if the secret is set up with automatic rotation, which is something we support, you could just click a button, and we'll just like swap out the locks in all your secrets. It's really powerful, works really fast. There's no action you need to do besides clicking a button. If it is not rotatable, then you'd go in and you generate a new key, you'd put them in all the places, and then you'd revoke the old one. And again, that could be pretty quick too. And we have the ability to have kind of like pull requests with Doppler, where you can get a second pair of eyes and you can say, okay, here are all the secrets that are going to change. 1, 2, 3, go. Like, let's change it. And just like you can with like a pull request with code. And so that is what the fire drill would look like. It would have a complete audit story around it. It would have two people to approve it, or 2 eyes before anything gets approved. And you kind of have this like guarantee that you know where that secret is being used, how old it is, what the metadata around that secret, before you take any action.
The one-click solution, I feel like that's such a sell for a lot of problems out in the world.
And it can get even easier. If you have automatic rotation enabled on your secrets, then you may actually look at that secret and be like, we rotated that secret a month ago, so we don't need to do anything. We're fine. Because that is like, it's like a key to a lock that has like been removed. So so it doesn't matter if that key exists or not. You could have it, but it doesn't open any door anymore. And so with automatic rotation, you could be in a case where like, that secret got leaked. Glad we were automatically rotating it. Doesn't matter to us. Moving forward, no action need to be taken.
I think like technically it's kind of like the analogy of like one-time passwords basically. I feel like sometimes where it's like, oh, just generate a new password with that. For the people who have used one-time password, I feel like it's very much the same vein of how to think about it. Maybe one of the harder questions, if anything, you may or may not like hard questions. You probably do. In terms of compliance and in terms of like even your own safety of Doppler. So what I mean by this is that I look at applications like one password or LastPass and all that. And I'm like, oh, wow, it's like a password manager. But what if somebody just gets access to your OnePass? You're like exponentially more breached than what you were originally if you just had your separate passwords all spread out kind of thing. So playing devil's advocate, I'm seeing like Doppler, it's great. You have a lot of like concentration of where all your keys and everything. But then on the other flip side of like, wait, I could just get the access of Doppler or somebody else. You've spent hours thinking about this, if not more, and everything. How do you approach this compliance / like security of, I guess, like the app itself or like the feature itself?
Yeah, so like imagine we have 100-person engineering department, and we have 2 DevOps / security people in it, so like 2 total, 1 DevOps, 1 security, and then the rest are just like full-time engineers. Well, out of that, there's probably 1 or 2 accounts total that have access to all of the secrets. The rest probably have access to development and maybe CI/CD. So the risk profile is low, and each developer only has access to the products that they should have access to. So for most of the cases, it's a very low risk thing if account gets compromised, right? Because it's development credentials on a specific set of projects. Now, usually what we would recommend at this case is once they install Doppler and they get up and operational, they connect Doppler logging to a logging platform for anomalous. Basically, like, is there something weird going on that's happening in your account? And so if there was a very odd case or rare case of that one account that has access to everything is the one that gets breached, which would obviously be like a more like malicious targeted attack. You have anomaly detection that says, okay, well, this guy has never in his life downloaded all the secrets at one point in time, or never started downloading secrets this fast across this vast number of projects. That will immediately get flagged, and we'll be like, okay, there's something going on here. We need to take action, and you'll start getting alerts. And so, bare minimum, you'll know that it's what's happening, and then you can choose to act on however you want. You can shut down their account. You can do whatever, but that is at least the bare bones of it all.
And I keep on saying there's not one perfect solution to all this, but of course, like, if you are aware of it, that's number one, that protects you a lot. And then the other part of having, as we were saying, these steps that you could do, that's better than just not having anything. This is Perry geeking out even more recently. I hear about these, how do you call it, certifications, I guess? I've worked in healthcare and I've worked in finance, and a lot of like apps, like technology-wise, you have to have a certain standard, and then you get the certification to be like, oh, we are fully compliant to blah, blah, blah. Is there a vein of Doppler that kind of addresses that as well, in a sense of like trying to meet certain like official... Honestly, I don't even know who issues these certifications. Don't get me wrong. I'm very ignorant in this space, but maybe from your perspective of like what you've seen, what you understand, and what you're looking forward to in anything, what is this vein of like maybe Doppler and certifications and compliances and like government bodies? Like, what did that ecosystem look like to you?
Well, there's SOC 2, which is supposed to have compliance around secrets management, but it really doesn't. And I would say that's the main one that should have. That's the big gap. I would say one of the big problems is that SOC 2 is really managed by like tax auditors, like accountants. And so it's not really like security people. Because it started from an accounting, like it didn't start, SOC 2 did not start from a place of, we want to help you secure your applications. Like SOC 1 was all about, let's make sure you're financially sound. And then SOC 2 was like, let's make sure you're technologically sound. But I think that's the big gap. So I wish there was something that said you have to use a secrets manager. There isn't one today unless you're like going after like government contracts where there's FedRAMP involved. But outside of the that, there really isn't much. And that's a huge gap in the market. That like it should be an absolute requirement. Like no questions asked. It should be a requirement to use a secrets manager of some type.
Yeah, I definitely echo the good practice more than anything. But as you were saying, if one day it does become a requirement, anything, maybe Doppler is well positioned. This is just usually what Perry usually thinks about at the end of the day of like, who's positioning where for that? And for the people, I know a lot of people have been scarred by SOX, if anything. I think it's like sorely ox something. It stands for like a legal term, if anything. I remember reading into a lot of that because we had to implement it at the end of the day. Can I take a moment to really just like reel back to the startup world and the Silicon Valley, or maybe more than Silicon Valley is when we talk about culprits of just bad security. In my head, there's different phases, right? There's the seed companies, there's a Series A company, there's a one-person companies, and then there, of course, is like the latter ones, like Series D IPO companies. Do they all approach this problem of secrets management the same way? As in, like, is the expectation of, like, let's say they know of Doppler, they'll be like, that's going to solve all my problems, regardless if I'm a small company or a big company. What is the interaction there? Is Doppler meant for everyone, or is there a certain, like, size of companies better for Doppler than other ones?
Yeah, I would say great question. We really perform the best with larger companies. I would say the product works very well for individuals, seed companies, Series A companies, and they actually should use a secrets manager, Doppler being one of them. But the pain is the greatest because you have the most to protect the larger you get. And so I would say our sweet spot right now is Series B companies to pre-IPO. That's where we perform the absolute best. And then we have a fair amount of like public companies, like I mentioned, like Accenture, that have much larger deployments at scale that we do quite well with too. But usually when you get to that large, it's a lot of like, it's like a Jenga set, you know what I mean? Like everyone has crazy infrastructure. It's very old, and you're kind of like putting pieces together, and you try to take this modern philosophy of like engineering and apply it to an older way of doing things. And I don't want to call out Accenture in particular, but more just like in general, like older enterprises, they typically have wild infrastructure, and so you have to kind of meet them where they are.
That's funny because I will make the exact same case for even younger companies. Of course, like we could spend 2 more hours talking about this, but in my head, it's more like, oh yeah, Wild West when you're a Series A, pre-seed, seed, like you can do whatever you want. Who cares about security? Who cares about all of that? But then, as you were saying, like larger companies also have that kind of same like positioning where we've had infrastructure for the past 30 years, and some pieces are just not maintained anymore on that. Is it that obvious, I guess, that like, or even not obvious that it's fairly the same on both ends? It's kind of like you would see the same symptoms. Like, let's say you're a dentist and you're looking at this, you would see kind of like the same symptoms on both ends of this range.
I think by the time you get that large, the symptoms are quite different, I would say. At like a smaller scale company, it usually comes first of not security, because like security is not really felt until you have a really, really bad, like it's like you get into an accident. And so like at that point, and when you're in incident mode, that's like the worst of it. And so you don't really feel the pains of security that early on. You feel a lot of the productivity gains of like, or the productivity problems, like, oh, I have to get secrets into production, and that's a really slow, dangerous process. Or I don't know where all my secrets are, and so like developers are constantly like banging their heads against the wall because development just breaks all of a sudden, and these random builds are broken. We hear a lot about that, and I would say that it phases up and down. Like when you're like a Series B company, you feel it a lot. When you get to like D level, like you probably have something in place. It's not great, but it's not as painful anymore. And then when you get to another stage higher, it's like broken again because like things are so much bigger than they were when you built it at like Series D. And then large enterprises often feel it, but it's those companies are so unbelievably big that it just kind of gets muted in the noise.
Yeah, and nowadays there's so much noise everywhere. But if there's a solution that could help, as you were saying, like manage it better, I think a lot of people do have time and ears for that kind of stuff. We've spoken so much about technical topics and non-technical topics, of course, about secrets management and everything. I just want to come back to Brian real quickly. If anything, is that it's not easy. It's not easy trying to build this product and trying to build a team and trying to sell it and trying to get so many parts to it. So maybe for you is like, how do you focus, I guess, your attention in the sense of, if I look at it from a, I guess, team's perspective, is you got to decide, do we spend all our time building stuff and then marketing it, or do we do both at the same time? So maybe a two-part question for you is, at the moment you work with a team that's building a really fun product, if anything, is how do you figure out in terms of looking forward of, oh, we should definitely spend more time just like marketing it, or we could just like spend more time refactoring and making sure that our product is more stable? And that's the first part to the question. And the second part is, how do you do that with yourself? How do you manage your own time? How do you just do more building? I don't know if you code anymore. So that's the two-part question of how in the world are you managing to build all this today?
Well, today sadly I would say I'm not coding it every day. I wish I was. We have really good leaders in almost every department, and the model that we work on today is very much like a little bit of a later stage company. We have revenue goals that get set on a yearly level. We then reverse engineer them into monthly goals. Those goals are then segmented and partitioned into like team goals, and those team goals are then distributed to our leaders. And so we have marketing has their goals, and so the marketing team is always marketing. They're always running. The sales team is always running too, and the engineering team is doing what they can to help support those go-to-market teams, and also make sure that we're pioneering the way forward. We're not just like building stuff to close deals, but we're building things that are the right things to build for the market and for the industry. And so my job is really to look in the future and figure out what are the things that we should be building a year from now, or 8 months from now, and make sure that we have the resources, the time, the energy to go after those. Sadly, I'm not in the day-to-day of coding anymore. I deeply miss it, and sometimes I want to go back and do it, but the problem is building is not the hard part of being an engineer. It's supporting and maintaining. And we have a rule at Doppler that if you build something, you're responsible for it. And there's no way I can reasonably be responsible for something I build. I can build it in my free time, but God knows I can't maintain it. And so that is the problem of, I think, any leader, like especially a technical one. When the company grows, like there were someone in Y Combinator said this to me, of like, your job as a CEO is to play the meta games, where you get really good at this game, like building the product. And then all of a sudden, at some point, you get so good at that you got to stop doing that, and you got to go find the people that go now build the product for you. And then you get really good at that, and now you got to do one layer on top of that of like go hire the people that will manage those people. And so your job is to always play the metagame where like whenever you get comfortable, that's probably a sign you should stop and then get uncomfortable again by go one layer up. Um, and so yeah, that is the I would say that the journey of a startup founder. And it has a lot of perks, but it also has some downsides. And I do miss coding every day. I miss it so much, but I chose a path.
I think a lot of people will agree the same that, like, of course I would love to write all this code and everything. I just don't want to deal with the CR. I just don't want to deal with all these comments and the PR reviews and everything and these back and forth in there, which obviously could be exponentially bigger depending how big the feature is at that point. So, of course, the tech show, what applications run your life at the moment? As in, like, the way I put this is probably like, okay, what's your top 3 favorite apps? Regardless if it's your phone, your computer, like, do you have any shout outs to what really runs, makes your life run better?
Perplexity is my main shout out. I don't have a lot of apps. I try to like minimize as much as possible, but Perplexity is like so good. I pretty much have completely swapped almost all my Google searches for Perplexity. That is the one, and then actually not a tech shout out at all, but just like something that I wish I knew years earlier is I love an air fryer. Like I never used to like cook at home. Like it was like, this is gonna take way too long to bake something in the oven, and using a microwave is just as good as pretty much ordering out. And my sister for like years would be like, Brian, you got to try this air fryer thing. It's really cool. And I was like, nah, cooking's not for me. And now I'm like, I'm cooking everything at home. I don't want to, I really don't want to order out. And so that was a fundamental change in like health for me. So for anyone who's like, I hate cooking, buy an air fryer, have some fun, and apply the engineering mindset to it. Like I try to like engineer good food now, which is quite fun.
I love asking this question of these apps. Every time I do these episodes, like there's always new, I guess, like shout outs that I kind of get. So of course people will say like, oh, we love Slack. Like Slack runs our life. Everything needs to happen on Slack. Some people are like, we need to use like Superman. I think that's what they called, like the email client app that some people really swear by. So thanks for sharing a lot of those technologies over there. Maybe if I could probably just like seek advice, that's probably the best part of saying it, is that like, on one front, when we were speaking about earlier, your environment kind of dictates a lot how you see, I guess, like challenges, how you see life and everything, where it's like, oh, let's do this, let's do that. But then on another front, it really depends on like if you're able to do it in the right context situation. Oh no, I have too much like studying happening at the moment. I have too much work happening at the moment and everything. So for you, in terms of talking to people about why you chose your path, what are the advices of either jumping into it, being like, just drop everything and do it, or do an educated approach of, okay, look, you're working, you're in school, but then you could take like your weekends, your time doing it. What does this talk kind of look like if you were to talk to somebody in a position to, consider going into a serial entrepreneurship adventure like yours?
Hot take here. May not be for everyone, so take it with a grain of salt. I think the people that are meant to do this will not need me to answer this question. I think they will know and they'll say, Brian, shut the fuck up. I'm going to go do it. And there's nothing you could tell me that will change my mind, because I was exactly like that, and I'm still like that to this day. And I think most of the great founders that I know are exactly like that. Does not matter how I'd answer this question. They know deep down in their hearts. I think if you're a person that needs to walk into it, you could still be a good founder, but I think you really gotta love it. Like you gotta feel like you were destined for this, because it is like eating glass. Like it straight up is. And if you don't have the tolerance for that, you should not be in this game. There are plenty other ways to get rich. There are plenty other ways to have fun. But if you really gotta want it, like you gotta so deep want it, and there's nothing I can tell you that will make you want it. That has to come from within.
That is absolutely refreshing. Thank you. Thank you so much for everything you've shared today. Thank you so much for all the stories that you've done and everything. I keep on saying that, like, your journey is obviously not over. I keep on saying it's an evolving journey. You've done so much so far, and obviously super excited to catch more of what's to come. But for the easiest way, where can people find Brian, and where can people find Doppler?
Yeah, you can find me at brian@doppler.com for my email. My LinkedIn is Brian Vallelunga, and I'm not really on Twitter anymore all that much. So if you DM me there, I may see it like a month later. So I'm not very big on social media. That's the one I would say. I know a lot of CEOs are. It just does not click with me. I not a big fan of social media. But I would say if you want the highest the highest chance you'll have of getting a reply from me is brian@doppler.com. I check my email more than almost anything else.
That's amazing. And of course, all the links will be shared down below. So please, please, please check them out. And also just think about your security practices. Anybody who's listening, just think about what you do, not just for your company and your work, but even just your day-to-day life. Maybe some people might be using Doppler for their day-to-day. Who knows at that point? But once again, on behalf of myself and on behalf of so much people who are just geek knowledge and everything, thank you, Brian, for being on the show.
Yeah, thank you.
And I will catch the rest of you on the next one. See you later. Bye. And that was Brian Vallelunga, founder and CEO of Doppler. All the links are shared in the description notes below. Go check them out. If you would like to be on Podcast Room by Software Engineer, reach out to us. Just email contact@perrytiu.com. Can't wait to have you on the show. Once again, thank you so much for listening to Podcast Room by Software Engineer. Don't forget to hit the follow button on your podcast app and leave us a review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. It's completely free. And if you want to tell your friends about Podcast Room by Software Engineer, that's totally cool as well. Anyways, I am Perry Tiu, and I'll catch you on the next one. Big love.